It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The church was filled with the scent of fresh flowers, the soft glow of candlelight flickering around the room, and the gentle hum of excited whispers among the guests. The bride stood at the front of the church, her heart racing with both excitement and nerves. She was wearing an exquisite white wedding dress, embroidered with delicate lace that shimmered under the soft light. Her veil cascaded down her back like a waterfall, and her hands trembled as she held the bouquet of white roses. The groom, a tall and handsome man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, stood opposite her. His face was a picture of joy as he gazed at the woman he was about to marry. His eyes sparkled with love, and his smile radiated happiness. They had spent months planning this day, and everything seemed perfect. The guests, family, and friends sat eagerly, their eyes fixed on the couple, waiting for the moment to unfold. The priest began the ceremony, his voice echoing softly in the large, grand church. The couple exchanged loving glances as the vows approached. This was supposed to be a day of joy, a day that would mark the beginning of a beautiful journey together. But as the priest asked, "Do you, bride's name, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" the atmosphere suddenly shifted. The bride, whose face had been glowing with happiness moments before, suddenly looked uncertain. She hesitated. Her grip on the bouquet tightened as she looked into the groom's eyes. His smile faded as he saw the change in her expression. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. The music seemed to fade into the background, and the whispers from the guests became muffled, as if the whole world had paused. I need to tell you something," the bride whispered, her voice barely audible, but still clear enough for the groom to hear. The groom's brow furrowed with confusion, his expression shifting from excitement to concern. He stepped closer to her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been expecting the usual vows, the exchange of rings, and the declaration of love. But this moment, was different. The crowd held its breath, sensing something was wrong. The bride's eyes began to fill with tears. "I'm sterile," she said, her voice trembling with fear and vulnerability. "I can't have children." A hush fell over the room. The guests exchanged glances, stunned by the sudden revelation. The groom's face turned pale. His mouth went dry, and he could hardly believe what he was hearing. He blinked several times, as if trying to process her words. The air felt thick, like the weight of the moment was pressing down on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. His mind raced with thoughts of how this revelation could change everything. For the bride, the silence that followed was deafening. Her heart ached with the fear of what might happen next. She had never imagined that her secret would come out like this, on the most important day of her life. She had hoped to keep it hidden, to spare the groom the disappointment she feared he would feel. She had struggled with her infertility for years, and it had been a source of deep personal pain. The thought of telling him had always been terrifying. Now, standing at the altar in front of their friends and family, it felt like the weight of her secret was too much to bear. Her voice cracked as she spoke again, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't want to tell you like this. I was afraid that you would leave me. I didn't want to ruin today. But I couldn't keep this from you any longer." The groom still stood frozen, his expression a mixture of shock and confusion. His lips parted, but it was as if the words he wanted to say were caught in his throat. He had never imagined this moment would be anything other than pure happiness. His mind raced with questions. Was she telling him the truth? Why hadn't she told him before? How would this change their future together? The bride's hands trembled as she held onto his, desperate for him to understand. She had prepared herself for this moment for so long, but now that it had arrived, she was overwhelmed by the fear of rejection. She couldn't look at the guests. She couldn't bear to see the judgment in their eyes. But most of all, she was terrified of losing him, the man she loved more than anything in the world. A deep silence filled the room, broken only by the faint sound of her nervous breathing. The guests were in shock, unsure of how to react. The priest stood frozen, not sure how to guide the ceremony forward. Everyone's attention was focused on the couple, but the space between them seemed to grow with every passing second. The groom finally blinked, and his voice broke through the silence. I don't know what to say," he whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me before? Why now?" The bride's chest tightened as the tears began to flow freely down her face. "I didn't know how. I didn't know if you could love me knowing this," she admitted, her voice filled with raw emotion. The groom stood there, his heart aching for her, for the pain she must have felt. He could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty that had been hidden behind her smile all these years. And as he looked at her, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just a revelation of a secret. This was the woman he loved, standing before him, vulnerable and exposed. The church was still. The bride's confession echoed in the silence, and the groom stood motionless, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. The words, "I am sterile," rang in his ears, but they seemed almost impossible to comprehend. His body was numb as his eyes searched the face of the woman he loved, looking for a hint of what to do next. The guests were waiting, their eyes flickering between the bride and groom, unsure of what would happen in this unexpected moment. For a few seconds, it felt like the world had stopped moving. The room, which moments ago had been filled with joy and excitement, now felt cold and heavy. The groom's thoughts raced, and his stomach twisted into knots. His hands, once steady and strong, now trembled slightly as he reached out for hers. His fingers brushed against her soft skin, but the touch felt distant, like they were separated by an ocean of uncertainty. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he whispered, his voice quiet but filled with hurt. The question seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. The bride's face crumbled with guilt. She couldn't look at him, couldn't bear the weight of his gaze. She had been afraid of how he might react, afraid that he would walk away. This secret had been her burden for so long, a secret she never wanted to share. But now, here she was, standing in front of him, hoping that he would understand. "I didn't know how," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "I was scared that you would leave me." Her words cut through him like a sharp knife. His heart ached as he watched her, her eyes filled with tears, her body trembling with fear. He had always known she carried some pain, but this was something deeper, something more fragile than he had ever realized. He felt a pang of regret that he hadn't seen it sooner, that he hadn't understood the weight she had been carrying all this time. The guests, who had been waiting for the exchange of vows, were now silent, holding their breath. No one moved. It was as if everyone was waiting for the groom's response, waiting for him to either forgive her or walk away. He stared at her for what seemed like an eternity, trying to make sense of everything. His mind was spinning. How could this happen? How could the woman he had planned to marry, the woman he had envisioned building a family with, tell him this? He had imagined their future together. Children, a house full of laughter, a family they would create together. And now, with this revelation, all of that felt uncertain. "How could you keep this from me?" he asked again, his voice shaking now, the hurt more evident. His face was flushed, his jaw clenched tight. It wasn't anger that he felt, it was confusion. His love for her hadn't changed, but the shock of what she had said made it hard to think clearly. The bride flinched at his words, as if each one was a blow. She had feared this moment, the moment where her secret would shatter everything they had built together. "I was afraid," she said softly, her voice filled with sorrow. "I didn't want you to look at me differently. I thought you might leave, and I didn't want that to happen. I love you so much, and the thought of losing you, it terrified me." Her words were raw and vulnerable, and the groom's heart softened just a little. He had always known how much she loved him, how deeply she cared for him. But hearing her say this, hearing the raw emotion in her voice, made him realize just how much she had been hiding. The burden she carried was heavier than he had ever imagined. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair, trying to clear his mind. His thoughts were a storm, each one crashing into the next. He had always believed that love could conquer anything, that there was nothing the two of them couldn't face together. But this was different. This was a reality he hadn't prepared for. As he stood there, trying to process everything, the bride's tears fell freely. She didn't know what to say anymore. She had told him the truth that had haunted her for years, and now she feared that it would tear them apart. "I never wanted this to change things between us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I wanted to give you everything, but I don't know if you can love me the way I am. I don't know if you can forgive me for keeping this from you." The groom took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. He needed time to think, but there was something inside him, something deep in his heart, that made him pause. As much as he was hurt and confused, he knew he had to be honest with himself and with her. "I don't know what to say," he finally admitted, his voice quieter now, more composed. "I don't know if I'm ready for this, but I can't just walk away from you. I love you, but I need to understand why you didn't trust me enough to tell me sooner. I need to know that we can work through this." The room felt tense, the silence thick with the weight of the moment. The guests watched with bated breath, unsure of what would happen next. The bride looked at him with wide, desperate eyes, her heart pounding in her chest. She had given him the truth, and now she was waiting, praying that it wouldn't be the end. The groom's words lingered in the air, and for a moment, it seemed like time had stopped. The future of their relationship was hanging by a thread, and neither of them knew what would come next. But in that moment, both of them understood one thing: they still loved each other. The question now was whether love alone could overcome the challenge that lay ahead. The silence in the church was deafening. It felt like time had frozen. The bride stood before the groom, her heart racing in her chest, her body trembling from the weight of what had just been revealed. She could feel every eye in the room on them, but all she could focus on was the man before her, the man she loved with all her heart. His face was still a mixture of shock and confusion, and his grip on her hands was weak, as though he wasn't sure whether to hold on or let go. For a moment, she felt as if the entire world had shifted beneath her feet. She had waited so long to tell him her secret, and now that the truth was out, she didn't know what would happen. She had expected anger, disappointment, maybe even a broken heart. But what she hadn't expected was the look of deep conflict in his eyes. He hadn't walked away, but the uncertainty in his gaze made her wonder if there was any chance for their future. The priest, who had been standing quietly in the background, now looked unsure of what to do. The ceremony was supposed to be about love and joy, but instead, it had turned into an emotional battlefield. The guests were whispering amongst themselves, still trying to process the revelation. Some looked on in pity, while others seemed uncomfortable, not knowing how to respond to the tension between the bride and groom. The bride's eyes flickered nervously as she awaited the groom's reaction. She had never felt more vulnerable in her life. She had hoped for an easy, happy wedding day. But now, standing at the altar, she realized that life was rarely that simple. But then, something unexpected happened. The groom's eyes narrowed slightly, and his jaw clenched in determination. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then, without warning, he dropped to his knees. The gesture was so sudden, so unexpected, that the bride gasped. She had no idea what he was doing, and for a split second, her heart skipped a beat. Was this the moment he was going to walk away? But instead, he looked up at her, his face filled with a mixture of love and resolve. "You think I'm going to walk away from you?" he said softly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "You think this changes how I feel about you?" The bride's breath caught in her throat. She had no words, no way to process what was happening. The groom was kneeling in front of her, his face a mask of calm, but his eyes revealed everything: his pain, his confusion, but most of all, his commitment. She had never expected him to react like this. She had never imagined that in the face of such a deep secret, he would still find the strength to love her. "You've just told me something that has shaken me," he continued, his voice raw but filled with sincerity. "And yes, I am hurt. Yes, I'm confused. But that doesn't mean I'm giving up on us. It doesn't mean I'm walking away from you." Tears welled up in the bride's eyes as she looked at him. She had feared this moment for so long, the moment when her secret would tear them apart. But instead of anger or rejection, she saw something entirely different in his eyes. She saw a deep, unwavering love, a love that was willing to face the hardest truths and move forward. The guests were silent now, watching the moment unfold. Some wiped their eyes, moved by the raw emotion between the couple. Others exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond to what was happening before them. It wasn't just a wedding anymore. It had become a defining moment of trust, vulnerability, and love. The groom slowly stood up, his gaze never leaving the bride. He took her hands in his and gently pulled her toward him. "I'm not here because I expect perfection," he said, his voice now filled with tenderness. "I'm here because I believe in you. I believe in us. And nothing will change that." The bride's knees felt weak beneath her as the weight of his words settled in her heart. She had spent so many years hiding this part of herself, terrified that it would push people away. But here he was, holding her, not with pity, but with understanding. She had expected him to be angry, to question her, to turn away. But instead, he was offering her something far more precious, his acceptance. "I know this is hard," he continued, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "I know this is not what either of us imagined. But we'll figure it out. Together. I'm not going anywhere." The bride's chest tightened with emotion as she finally let herself relax into his embrace. She had feared so much, but in that moment, all of her fears seemed to fade away. She wasn't alone. She had him by her side, and that was all that mattered. The future was uncertain, but with him, she felt a renewed sense of hope. As the groom held her, his words echoed in her mind. Together. That was all she needed to hear. She knew that their journey wouldn't be easy, but they would face it together. They would navigate the challenges, the doubts, and the unknowns. Because love, she realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about choosing each other, no matter what. And as they stood there, in the center of the church, the bride and groom knew that they had just taken the first step toward a future neither of them had expected, but one that was filled with love, trust, and an unbreakable bond. The church was filled with the soft murmur of voices, but it was as if the bride and groom were in their own world, standing before everyone but seeing only each other. After the emotional exchange, everything felt different. The tension that had gripped the room only moments earlier had now lifted, replaced by something more profound. Hope. The groom stood beside his bride, his hand tightly holding hers, a look of unwavering determination in his eyes. They had just weathered a storm together, and now, as the air around them settled, they were ready to take the first step toward a new chapter in their lives. The bride, still standing before him, felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The fear and anxiety that had consumed her in the past months, even years, began to fade away. In this moment, the truth wasn't something to be ashamed of. Instead, it was something that had brought them closer, something that had deepened the bond they shared. She had come into this church that day with so much fear, terrified of what would happen when her secret was revealed. But now, standing here, she realized that their love was stronger than any challenge life could throw their way. The priest, who had been a silent witness to the emotional moment unfolding before him, finally spoke, his voice soft but firm. "Do you, bride's name, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and cherish him for all your days, no matter what challenges come your way?" He asked, his words carrying weight and wisdom. The bride's gaze never wavered from her groom. His presence, his unspoken support, made her feel as though nothing could stand in their way. She took a deep breath, her heart filled with more love than she thought possible. This wasn't just about getting married anymore. It was about a shared commitment to face life together, with all its ups and downs. "I do," she said, her voice steady now, free from the fear and vulnerability that had once held her back. The groom looked at her, his eyes filled with emotion. "And do you, Groom's name, take this woman, your wife, to love and support her, in sickness and health, for better or for worse, through all the twists and turns of life?" The priest continued. The groom nodded, his gaze never leaving the bride. His face softened with tenderness as he spoke the words that would forever bind them together. "I do." The guests watched quietly, moved by the sincerity and depth of the vows exchanged. The uncertainty that had lingered moments before was gone, replaced by a powerful sense of unity. It was no longer just a wedding. It was a declaration of their shared future, a future that would not be without its challenges, but one they would face together, hand in hand. The priest smiled warmly at them, recognizing the significance of the moment. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The groom leaned in slowly, gently brushing his lips against the bride's. It was a kiss that sealed not just their vows, but their commitment to each other, to a life of honesty, love, and mutual respect. The audience erupted in applause, but the bride and groom hardly noticed. In that kiss, they found something deeper, something stronger than anything they had imagined. Their journey had just begun. As they stood together at the altar, hand in hand, the weight of the moment began to settle into their hearts. The bride, feeling the love and warmth of her new husband, smiled up at him. She had never felt more loved or more understood than in this moment. Despite the fear she had carried for so long, despite the uncertainty of how her secret would affect them, she now felt a peace she had never known. The groom, too, felt a sense of clarity. He had come into this day expecting something entirely different, but what he had received was even greater. Love, he realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about embracing each other's flaws, accepting the parts of each other that were broken or imperfect, and choosing to grow together. And that was exactly what he was ready to do with her. As they turned to face the guests, they knew their love story was just beginning. The road ahead would not always be smooth, but they would walk it together with honesty, trust, and the understanding that no secret, no matter how difficult, would ever drive them apart. Their love had been tested, but it had emerged stronger than before. Hand in hand, the bride and groom walked down the aisle, their hearts full of hope and their minds set on the future. The guests cheered, but the couple didn't hear the applause. They were too caught up in each other, in the quiet promise they had made, to face whatever came next together. They had crossed the hardest part of their journey, the part where fear and uncertainty had threatened to take over. But now, they were moving forward into a new beginning, and as they stepped outside the church, the sunlight breaking through the clouds above them, they knew that this was only the start of their story. The future was bright, not because it was perfect, but because they would face it side by side. And that was all they needed.